We are grateful, oh God, for the fact that we are not alone in a time like this, that you're with us and that we are with each other. We ask, oh God, that you would meet us in a way that's deeper than just a podcast, or deeper than just some words said on a screen or into a microphone, but into something that feels like it lands in the space where people are suffering and where we need deep and deeper understanding. So we cry out to you for this good gift. And we thank you that we get to have this conversation together. In Jesus' name.
Amen.
It's my great joy today to welcome Dr. Dwight Radcliff to be the Conversing podcast conversation partner today. Dwight is a great gift to me and to Fuller. He's been around Fuller for a decade or so in many different seasons of his life and degrees. He has recently graduated with his PhD in intercultural studies just last spring. And soon after that, he was appointed to be the assistant provost for the William E. Pinnell Center for African American Church Studies and the assistant professor of mission, theology, and culture. So, Dr. Radcliff, Dwight, thank you for joining in this conversation today.
Thanks for having me, Mark. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Both of us felt, I think, a great urgency of wanting to have a conversation that might be shared with others about all the racial dynamics that are exploding in recent weeks, even recent days, even the last 24 hours in various parts of the United States. And it just really means a lot to me that you would be willing to have the conversation. And what I want us to focus on is really not thinking about the whole wide array of things that we could talk about today, but really when a moment like this happens, I think the most important thing is to be able to listen. And I really want to set this conversation up today by saying I'm here myself to genuinely listen. I want to hear you lead us into reflections that you've had about what is happening in Black pain, what is happening in the Black church, what's happening in the Black culture and society beyond the church, what's happening that is not seen, underheard, unappreciated. I just feel like there's a whole array of things that you could give us insight into. And this is not a fix-it podcast. None of my podcasts are that. This is not a let's go out and all be cheerleaders for this or that. This is a moment where we desperately need action, but important action, wise action, has to be grounded in reality. So, Dwight, thank you for having this conversation. And let's just begin by, honestly, just a very open-ended question. What are you seeing, hearing, and feeling yourself?
Wow. Anger, frustration, the need to do more than what has been done. I think that many of the people that I talk to and we fully recognize, and I just think it probably just needs to be said just in a context like this, that there's no way that I can speak for the myriad and multiple manifestations of Blackness, even within America or the African diaspora in general. But I think that in a very real way, many of us in the Black community are just feeling a continued sense of pain, of vulnerability. I think in a conversation that you and I had, I said it's one thing to experience the frustration over these rhythms, these continued cycles of particularized violence against particularized demographics, to see violence specifically against Black bodies, to see it specifically happen under the guise of law enforcement repeatedly, to see this, to borrow my colleague Aaron Dorsey's word, just to see this continued rhythm, this cycle continue to happen is one thing. To be outraged by it as a human being is one thing. But then to understand that the targeted demographic is me, to understand that it's not enough that I'm just outraged or I'm upset about it, but at the same time, I am that vulnerable population. And there's such a furious powerlessness that comes with it. There are so many saying that this should happen or that should happen. And I think that that's what I hope that you and I can converse about and dialogue with in the course of this conversation. But initially, my response to your question, what am I feeling? What am I sensing? What am I hearing? There is just pain and outrage. And I do feel in these seasons that the most expressive terms that we could come up with simply don't sum up the feeling that so many are having, the feeling of being targeted, of being victimized, of being marginalized, of being hunted, of being literally hunted in the same nation that we pay taxes for. What does it mean to exist, to try to exist without feeling as though you are just an endangered species and that your life at the end of the day does not matter, that a window of a building tends to have more value than the totality of my being and my existence. And that's a pain that I think even running to the Psalms, I just don't find the words to attach to that feeling and the emotion.
Dwight, when you think about that sensation that often African-American men say about feeling that they're hunted, that they're found guilty of running while Black or driving while Black or walking while Black or doing anything else while Black, has that experience been personal to you?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think the reason why my phone tends to ring when another of these, and I want to say that although there have been the most popularized do tend to be Black males, that our Black sisters, our Black women are targeted just as much. But I want to say that I think the reason why my phone rings so much is because I do have a history in law enforcement. So there are those that feel that I sometimes have maybe a different perspective or a unique perspective. But even in my own personal life, as a kid, we were riding bikes through some portion of Inglewood, and we experienced the infamous brutality of the Inglewood PD, especially in that time. I have been pulled over. The times that I've been harassed, the most were probably Torrance PD, and many of us in the Black community in the LA area, we know the reputation that Torrance PD had at one time. I can recall being my car stalling on Crenshaw Boulevard on the border between Inglewood and Los Angeles, and my car stalling and calling AAA and having my hazard lights on and having, and I can't remember if it was Inglewood PD or LAPD, approach my car with guns drawn as I'm sitting in traffic with my hazard lights on. I can recall times where Long Beach PD, my wife and I were driving a Mercedes at the time in our Sunday best, driving in Long Beach and being pulled over for supposedly a traffic stop that we were never issued any citation or any warning for. But Long Beach PD officer approached the window with his gun. And so there's just times personally growing up in South LA, there are times where I have experienced the weaponization of Blackness, that being Black automatically means something that it doesn't mean anywhere else, that being Black automatically means that you are a threat. Being Black automatically means that you are violent. It automatically means that you are, that extra force has to be engaged. This weaponization of Blackness I have experienced personally. And I think the history of that, going back to slave trade, to slave auctions, to how slaves were categorized, that history, this nation has not lost that. This nation has not forgotten that, but it is very much at play. And those that know me know that in my life, I've never had a gang affiliation. I've never been a very just violent person myself, but none of that matters, because the moment that my pigmentation and phenotypes come into play, I am automatically weaponized. The audio over and over of the gentleman killed in Oklahoma, where the officer in the helicopter sees the Black man come out of his vehicle and he says, "This looks like a bad dude." And how you make that assumption from a helicopter is is exactly the point that I'm making here, that even someone who I don't consider myself particularly harmful, I don't consider myself particularly threatening, but the fact that I carry the skin and the phenotypes that I do, it has made me personally, and as a culture and a community, it makes us a target for an exaggeration of response.
So tell us a little bit more about your family then. Your wife is Deshaun. How has Deshaun or your two daughters experienced this?
So when we had a few years ago, kind of the height, it seemed like every week there was another videotaped massacre, videotaped assassination, videotaped murder of a Black body after the next. There was a season, and I suspect that it will begin to happen again, where my wife and I, even though we have the tracking systems on the phone where you can kind of tell where everyone is, if I tell my wife that I'm going to the grocery store and I've been gone for what she deems as too long for a grocery store run, she is literally calling my phone, and she needs to hear my voice and see where I am. We recently relocated to a smaller city, smaller town, and as a Black family moving into a small town in Southern California, that can immediately go one of two ways. And so we were very anxious and very nervous about what did that mean. I'm glad to say that most of my neighbors and the community have been extremely warm and welcoming and inviting. But driving yesterday, I went to Ralph's. So coming home from the grocery store, it wasn't dark yet, but it was getting evening, and I passed a police car, and I was extremely tense and anxious about what that meant. And my wife carries the same. My daughters carry that same concern. What will happen to their father if he's pulled over, especially in majority, predominantly white neighborhoods? We live, with that trauma, with that fear, with that angst and anxiety day in and day out, knowing that even in places that have presented themselves neighborly and even in places that have presented themselves friendly, there is still this fear that getting a traffic ticket might be my funeral. And that's a reality. That's not an over-exaggerated fear. That is a reality that Black men and Black women specifically live with and embody. As my daughters are living, I'm always tracking where they're going, who they're with, and I don't have sons, but having even Black daughters, having conversations with them about watching their surroundings. It's just, this is the fruit. This is the full-grown tear of the theological seeds that this nation has planted so long ago, and unfortunately, it is lived out on the backs and lives of Black people.
One of the things that some people have been saying in recent days, because of the rioting and everything, has been this sense that this shouldn't happen. I actually don't promote violence at all, but I will say that I actually have the opposite reaction to that. I look at what's happening and think, well, yeah, I mean, how could you not? What do you do with this long 400-year legacy, and it explodes in one particular moment, and now suddenly that's the crisis, whereas the real crisis is what you've described, the ongoing way of the way that Blacks have been perceived and placed and then weaponized. So I know that South LA County is not the same thing as Minnesota or Minneapolis. It's not the same thing as Georgia and a residential neighborhood, but for the reasons you've said, it has its own absolutely genuine dangers, and LA statistics bear that out. But when you think about not just your experience, but kind of the broader Black experience, which you've referred to, just say a bit more about what are the levels of pain when something like the murders of recent weeks unfolds. What are the triggers in people's bodies that they're carrying as Black people?
Yeah. If I can, I want to respond to that. But if I can, just add to what you've alluded to, I see a lot of social media posts that are using blanket responses to all protesters and during this time in Minnesota and other parts of the country. And I just really feel the need to say something, that if we're going to negatively characterize protesters in this season, at this particular junction in history, I think I would want to say maybe 3 or 4 things really quickly. Please. Before I address the pain and the trauma.
Before you implode, yes, go for it, please.
Yes, literally. That number one, those that would call solely for a type of peaceful protest, I would want to say very clearly that Black people have been peacefully protesting since 1619. So those that are saying that the only appropriate response to this is peaceful protest, that hasn't gotten us true equality. That hasn't gotten us true humanity in 400 years, right? I think I would also push, especially the Christian population that is pushing for this as the only appropriate response, to look at the Old Testament activity of God, this God that moves through an entire nation, wiping out the firstborn. I would urge us thirdly to look at even the riotous activity of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, who walks into a economic center in the temple and does damage. And then lastly, I think I would push us, Christian or not, to look at the riotous and rebellious history of the nation. Activity that we now call patriotic was at one point simply riotous and rebellious. And so I think it is, as James Cone said in Risks of Faith, he said, it is akin to a Black person protesting and then a white person with their foot on the neck of this Black person, literally in this image, I'm being deliberate, saying, we'll give you your freedom, but not if you're going to keep acting like that. And so I'm keenly aware that there are those that want protesting to look a certain way, and they need to be honest about the history of this nation. They need to be honest about biblical tradition and biblical record, and they need to be honest about the fact that as one frame or one way of protest has not produced the fruit of equality, of true inclusion, of right. True equity, and of true humanity. And so I don't think that is the way that we get the types of results that need to be seen in this nation. Mm-hmm. And to respond directly to your pain, to your comment of pain, there are those that have written books and have spoken much more eloquently than I could on post-traumatic stress of descendants of slaves. There are those that are doing research on the permanent trauma of persons of color, and specifically Black and brown bodies in urban centers. They could articulate better the generational trauma that may be carried in the DNA of Black and brown communities and Black communities. They could eloquently exegete what it means to be a person of color. I want to say as a theologian, I want to say as a pastor, I want to say as a Black man, that there is a level of embodied trauma that I carry, that I'm constantly walking into spaces conscious of who I am because of maybe my socioeconomic, maybe my economic demographic, the fact that I have a particular educational background. But at the end of the day, I'm very clear that the spaces that I walk into, I am seen as a Black man, and that the image of a Black man means something in this country. It means someone who is prone to violence. It means someone that is most likely raised in a broken home, most likely the product of a broken home and raising a broken home. There's so many different layers and stereotypes and histories that are attached to what it means to be a Black, specifically for me, a Black man. There are stereotypes that my wife walks around with, that what it means to be a Black woman. And those are embodied in very real ways that take physical, emotional tolls on us. And one of my fears in this time right now, as we are literally trying to center Black pain and Black responses and Black trauma, one of my fears is that there are too many Black clergy that don't have the theological tools to respond to that pain. That if you look at Black Pentecostalism in America, if you look at even the Black Baptist tradition in America, there's not always, even further to our Methodist tradition, there's not always a robust understanding of how do we respond theologically? How do we respond? What does our faith say to us as traumatized individuals who are being re-traumatized over and over again? The pain of being desensitized to Black murder. What does it do to Black people to watch your own image, your own likeness be brutalized over and over again? Some years ago, my father passed, and losing a parent is traumatic in its own way. But for me, it was traumatizing very specifically because my name is Dwight Anthony Radcliff Jr. So going to the mortuary to view my father's body, to see my name on an obituary, to see his casket and to see Dwight Radcliff on a casket, to see my name on his tombstone. It took me years before I could actually even go visit his gravesite, just because the trauma of seeing me as the dead victim. And that's what it means for Black bodies, men and women, to see over and over again our sons, our daughters manhandled at pool parties, our sons coming home from the convenience store, our sisters being pulled over for traffic stops, our brothers being shot and killed. To see this image over and over and over and over again, and then to borrow cone again and to be told to just be peaceful about it. There is a gut-wrenching response. There is a resounding hell no to anything other than there needs to be strong, visible response to what's happening, because that's what the pain is. The pain is tangible.
Right, exactly.
The pain is palpable.
Dwight, two things, excuse me, two things come out of that I think are really things I want to explore a little bit further. So first, your comments about sort of the desensitization within some Black communities of people whose spirituality or theology or whatever gave them a capacity to sort of segment off what they experienced in society and culture from what they wanted to choose to live inside, which was the theology and perspective of the African church or the African American church. How does that even happen? I mean, what is the construct that allows that desensitization to come about when the evidence every day is the counterpoint to that?
Yeah, I think if we trace the roots of revivalism in America and in Europe, but specifically in America, if we trace the roots of Pentecostalism and specifically Black Pentecostalism, and maybe the charismatic manifestations of the Baptist tradition, where there was usually less of a formalized theological education. I think what we see specifically within Pentecostalism is an eschatology really that has us focusing on the telos, that some glad morning when this life is over, I'll fly away. And so we have been indoctrinated in a in a type of theology, in a type of pneumatology, and in a type of eschatology that tells us that we can literally partition off that segment of life and turn our faces towards holiness and sanctification, and that in holiness and sanctification we will find eternal redemption. And that type of theological training, it allows the individual believer to dismiss current sufferings, or to simply categorize current sufferings as par for the course of Christianity. And we don't then hear the revolutionary nature of a Jesus of Nazareth, a dark complected individual in a Roman dominated culture, walking through life as a marginalized person and challenging systems. We don't hear Amos. We don't hear Jonah. We don't hear these prophets of old that screamed out that as much as we do to the least of these. We don't hear these prophets telling us to look out for the foreigner and the immigrant and the widow. And we don't hear that because our focus, our theological focus, has been informed by a pneumatology and an eschatology that tells us literally, when this life is over, I'll fly away. So we have lived with and embodied an escapist theology that allows us to partition off the present suffering. And so we just look at suffering as suffering in light of being a good soldier and being a good Christian. And there are so many clergy that don't have the theological framework to connect this suffering with what Jesus Christ has to say. And so there are pastors that are going to be challenged this weekend. And if I can take some liberty here, there are pastors that are going to be challenged this weekend to have to speak to what's happening, and they will mentally, they will see it as an exercise of stepping outside of Scripture in order to speak to reality. And I think that I would respond to those clergy as saying, how many times have we gone to a pastoral anniversary, a church anniversary, a building dedication, and we felt the need to look in Scripture and to hear how Scripture would speak to this event. But with this, we don't make the same connection. So I, on a very surface level, I would encourage that pastor to give the current climate of Black bodies, the plight of Black bodies and the climate of our nation. I would ask that you, at the very least, give it the same respect you would give your annual Usher Day.
Right. Amen. Amen.
Your church anniversary.
Oh my gosh. You know, when you think about that kind of construct, it really is a story in its own really tragic way of an elaborate theological coping mechanism, right?
Yeah.
And it is itself a reflection of what needed to be constructed to guard people's psychological, social, emotional health.
Yes.
And
yes.
There is great Christian hope that one day everything will finally be made right. But a focus on, as it were, the new Jerusalem, while failing to acknowledge the suffering of the moment, is really, it's not allowing the gospel to be the full gospel in our lives.
Right.
One of the other things I wanted to ask you is that some of the pain that you were describing, I can't imagine that there aren't people that might hear this broadcast whose social location would say to them, you know, what you're saying you experience and have experienced in terms of all of this is really more about projection than it is about what's actually happening. You think people are looking at Black bodies that way. They're not. That sort of phrase has been used several times in my life with people that I otherwise really regard as thoughtful people. But when it comes to these issues, they tend to just assume, no, really, again, you can't trust an African-American voice to tell its own true story. You have to assume that other people get to control the narrative. So how do you get out of that box that some people insist on putting African-Americans in?
Yeah. And I think that this is, I think there's two applications of what you've just described. Number one is the external internal application. How do Black voices assert themselves in these spaces and not have to rely upon non-Black voices to authenticate or to validate or to ordain those voices? I think that for those that are outside of the Black experience, I think it really, the challenge is sitting and listening deeply. I think the best analogy that I can give you, and then I want to come back to the internal application of that. The best analogy that I can give you is that some time ago I did a sermon series at our church, and it kind of took on a life of its own. And it was literally a series on hip hop culture and the church, and specifically with those manifestations of the church that feel like hip hop culture is absolutely demonic and there's nothing redeeming about it.
And this was all part of your doctoral dissertation, right?
Yeah. And so one of the analogies that I used is this. Let's say, God forbid, that there was a woman being raped outside of the church building, that church service is going on, and there's a woman being raped outside of the building, and she is fighting off her attacker and using every form of profanity known and unknown to humanity. I said, the problem with the church as it's currently constructed, especially the churches that I was speaking to, is that many of us would walk outside, and this is the response that we would give. Ma'am, we're going to help you, but first, would you please cut out some of that profanity? It's not God honoring, but we are going to help you. And I think that the ludicrous nature of that statement still is what we see here. It is many times the reason why authentically indigenous Black voices are not allowed to speak is because they don't tend to fit into the frameworks of the external person's community and their context. And so I think the first thing is you have to subject your own external context. You have to subject your own external theology and way of thinking and being to the reality that that person is describing. And if that person's reality is in your contextual definition profane or without God or ungodly, it doesn't matter because it still represents the voice and the expression of the pain that's happening in that community. And I think that happens, of course, between specifically white voices as a white context hearing Black voices. But then it also happens within Black culture, that there are the more established and recognized and respected Black voices that tend to be more mild, that tend to be older generationally, and they're often respected. And the voices of the younger generations tend to be relegated. And I think that even generationally, we must be open as the Black community and as the Black church to hearing the rawness, the visceral realities of the experiences of our millennials and our Gen Zers that are describing their reality. We must be just as open to that as we then, as maybe older generations, are commanding outside voices to be to us. And so I think that what you have your finger on the pulse of is important, not just as the Black community to be heard externally, but even internally, as we are making sure that we are listening to the raw and visceral voices of these upcoming generations and how they are experiencing, and even how they are theologizing outside of the context of orthodoxy. We need to hear that as well.
Well, and this is exactly why your dissertation was so profound, because you were trying in that dissertation to work out how do you lay hold of hip hop in a theologically responsible way that allows the vocabulary of many dimensions to actually present itself with its authentic witness, and for the church to take it with full seriousness rather than a kind of discipline. If you give up the swearing, then we can have a reasonable conversation. And your dissertation is obviously arguing for something much more than that. So we're not going to go into your dissertation at length right now, but I do want you, because it feels so relevant to what you just said, just describe a little bit more about how, even for you and in your own church settings, the embrace of hip hop was really, it's a kind of internal to Black church life, is the same tension that to some degree, as you just said, also exists outside church life and the way that other.
Yeah, I think the piece of that dissertation that speaks to what's happening right now is that I tried to track the Black theological enterprise, that if you go back to 1619, and if you go back to the institution of Black Christian faith in America, generationally, there are always generations that are raised up that begin to challenge the established order of the Black experience, into redefining what the Black experience means, into redefining what a theological expression of Blackness means. And that happens in every successive generation. James Cone and the Black concerned clergymen weren't the first generation in the 60s to start talking about what it meant to be Black and to think theologically. It happens in every successive generation. And then you have womanist theologians that come after Cone and say, well, you got it, but you're missing an entire expression of Blackness and the Black experience that you never even included. And then hip hop and those in the millennials and the Gen Z, they are doing the same thing. They're coming and say, wait, we might not sing the same hymns. We might not say it the way that you say it, but there is still a reality and a validity to Blackness as we've experienced it. And that needs to be given voice, just as you needed to be given voice in your time. And the thing that I love about that voice coming from my millennials and from my Gen Zers is that voice is unafraid to sound heretical. It's unafraid to delve into what we might call profane. To use Dan Hodges' title, profane faith, right? That it's not afraid to dig into areas that more orthodox, established denominational safety has said that's kind of off limits. And I think, just alluding to our previous conversation, that this is what I'm talking about, that we as the Black church we must walk hand in hand. We must be, and I want to affirm all the Black churches and Black clergy that have been on the front line for some time, right? Not just now, but have been there.
Yes.
I think you and I talked about even the work like Mike McBride and others that have been on the front line. And I affirm them. Yeah. And I just call the larger Black church, Black leadership, Black clergy to be open to embrace a non-orthodox expression of Black reality, of the Black existential plight, of Blackness, and of the Black theological enterprise that might not fit nicely in our denominational theological boxes.
So tonight, we may be both watching excerpts of the news coverage of various things that are happening really all around the country. Yeah. We're not going to be sitting in the same space because of COVID-19. So I won't be there to talk with you about what we're seeing, which I would love to do. But take us with you as you sit with Deshaun tonight and perhaps listen to or watch some of the news coverage. Where will this land for you? What are you going to be seeing?
Well, first and foremost is there will be tears. And in full disclosure, there will be tears and there will be profanity. I will be weeping because many of the preliminary reports that I have read coming out of Minnesota and other places, many of the protests as far as looting and vandalism, at least initial reports are saying that a lot of that activity was not actually instigated by Black bodies. And so there's a whole nother narrative of that. The military response to what will happen, the way that Black bodies will now be painted as the self-fulfilling prophecy. See, I told you those people were violent. See, I told you those people were lawless. So I will be crying and cursing because it is literally a damned if you do and damned if you don't. If Black bodies sit quietly and simply peacefully protest and run to Jesus in hopes of silent and unredemptive reconciliation, then nothing happens. And I don't mean that as a pessimist. I mean that as we have now 400 years of history to go back and say, no, this is the data. This is honest to God, what happens and what does and doesn't happen. And then there will be pain because there will be those who will ignorantly not understand what it means to be a Black man or woman in America, and will easily armchair quarterback what should or shouldn't happen, and will not have sat down, and whether it's in a podcast or whether it's in a private conversation, will not have spoken and heard from the pain and the agony coming from that context. And so those are the things that I will be lamenting. I will be running to, I think Psalm 13, how long, O Lord? I will be running to that in my spirit. I will be angry at the various narratives that will be spun. But more than anything else, I will be hurting. My wife and I both, we will be hurting. Yeah.
Dwight, I can't thank you enough for this gift. And it's a conversation that fortunately we've been having for a long time, and a conversation that we will continue to be having. And you are one of my teachers in this, and you are a gift. You are a leader that we need at Fuller and beyond. And we need you not just because of your capacities and gifts intellectually and otherwise, but we need you because of your heart and your faithfulness and your candor. And I feel like you've given us all of that today. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you for having us. Thank you for having this time. Thank you.